Hello, everyone, and thank you for participating in the Lytham Partners Spring 2022 Investor Conference. My name is Joe Diaz. I'm a managing partner at Lytham Partners. For this presentation, we welcome AcurX Pharmaceuticals, which trades on the NASDAQ exchange under the ticker symbol of ACXP. Representing AcurX today is David Luci, President and CEO. Mr. Luci will briefly run through a slide presentation, and we will engage in a brief fireside Q&A session afterwards. Before we begin, for those not familiar, Lytham Partners is one of the country's leading investor relations firm. With more than 2 decades of corporate access experience, we have built one of the industry's most diverse and effective platforms for connecting small cap companies with high quality and focused institutional investors, while creating a framework of best practices in all aspects of investor relations. One final item before we begin, I want to remind everyone that Mr. Luci will be available for one-on-one meetings later this week. If you have not already signed up, please visit the Lytham Partners website at lythampartners.com/virtual and click the one-on-one meetings request button. With that said, let me turn the proceedings over to David Luci, President and CEO of AcurX Pharmaceuticals. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joe. We're delighted to be with you for the Lytham Investor Conference, and happy to do one-on-one meetings as appropriate as we approach April 4th and the meeting date. AcurX Pharmaceuticals is a company developing the first new class of antibiotics, which, if approved, would be the first new class in over 30 years. And it's got a novel mechanism of action, which is important because of antimicrobial resistance, which is described as the next pandemic by the CDC and the World Health Organization, because bacteria increasingly is becoming resistant to the medicines available to kill it. And bacterial infections will become, according to the CDC and the WHO, the #1 killer worldwide, more than even cancer by 2050, unless there are not new antibiotics approved, but new classes of antibiotics approved, several between now and 2050. So that's what we're working on at AcurX. We started the company in early 2018, acquiring our lead antibiotic candidate, Ibezapolstat, from 2 retiring professors, research scientists at University of Massachusetts. Ibezapolstat is its name, and it targets the treatment of C. difficile infection. We're currently in a phase 2b trial for treating patients with C. difficile infection. And the phase 2a data is better than any data historically that's ever been out there to treat C. difficile infection, and we'll talk about that. The mechanism of action is that we inhibit the DNA polymerase 3C enzyme, which is the primary catalyst for building DNA in new low guanine and low cytosine gram-positive bacterial cells. That includes C. difficile. So by blocking the Pol3C enzyme and by getting into the cytoplasm of the gram-positive bacterial cell, in the case of our lead, that would be C. difficile bacteria. And in the case of our second antibiotic candidate, ACX375, that would be MRSA. We're able to kill the bacterial cell and stop the builder, the catalyst, the DNA Pol3C enzyme, from building more DNA to create new bacterial cells. So that's C. difficile is an unmet medical need, an urgent threat, according to the Center for Disease Control, to get new classes of antibiotics to treat C. difficile infection. The lead antibiotic that's used currently to treat C. diff infection is oral vancomycin, which is 60 years old, and it works poorly. It's a very vulnerable frontline therapy, and the patients experience a 20 to 40% recurrence rate. We'll talk about the size of the market. Basically, it's a $1.6 billion a year market in the US alone. And importantly, our phase 2A success, which preceded our phase 2B, showed that we cured all of the patients in the phase 2A, 100% cure rate at end of treatment, and there were 0 recurrences of infection 30 days after the end of treatment. So that data is unprecedented in the space. And the trial was set up for up to 20 patients, but our scientific advisory board determined after half the study was enrolled that we should move on to a phase 2B, given the efficacy and the lack of any safety issues. We did go public in late June 2021, raising over $17 million at $6 a share, 40% oversubscribed. So we launched the phase 2B trial in December with 14 activated sites. We're adding another 8 sites to make sure that we're able to hit our timeline, which is to kind of complete enrollment in the second half of this year. The 2A study data, in addition to the clinical success and the safety success, it showed that we're actually restoring the microbiome by the end of the 3rd day of a 10-day treatment regimen for patients that are on our Ibezapolstat. That's key because that's the lead factor, according to our scientists, in explaining why we're not seeing any recurrent infection. So the reinfection rate being 0 is not an anomaly from a low number of patients. It's got scientific underpinnings. In addition to that, a secondary factor for no reinfections is the bile acid data, which shows that we have a tremendously high percentage of secondary bile acids to primary bile acids. And having that kind of ratio of secondary to primary is a marker scientifically for a low reinfection rate. I may add that in prior clinical studies over 60 years, oral vancomycin, the standard of care, has just about a 180-degree opposite ratio of bile acids, primary to secondary, which may explain in part why they have a 20 to 40% recurrence rate, along with the destruction of the microbiome through treatment. We don't destroy the microbiome primarily, I believe, because we're a very narrow spectrum antibiotic targeting only C. difficile. So this chart is really the secret sauce. It shows the vancomycin percentage cure rates and sustained cure rates, along with fidaxomicin, which is a Merck drug. You can see the recurrences are a big problem, and there are several companies out there which are focused entirely on reducing the recurrence of infection. Those include Seres Therapeutics, Finch, which is now on clinical hold, and Summit Therapeutics, ridinolazole, which now failed phase 3. So the seas are parting, and the way toward frontline therapy for us is opening. You will talk more about competitive landscape, but Pfizer also 2 weeks ago announced failure of the Pfizer vaccine as frontline therapy. And they're focusing now on multiple resistant cases down the line from frontline. You see ridinolazole's percentage cures. With those percentage cures, they took on oral vancomycin head-to-head in an attempt to establish superiority, which based on their phase 2 percentages, we thought was a heavy lift. And sure enough, they did miss their primary endpoint. So you could see the 100% cures that we have with Ibezapolstat, both at end of treatment and at the follow-up visit, are much higher than the standard of care and everything else in the field. So antibiotics are still the name of the game. According to the Infectious Disease Society of America, they have a guidelines for the treatment of C. difficile, and antibiotics are the only thing on the list for recommendations outside of severe C. diff and multiple recurrent cases where fecal transplants are recommended because it's so severe. Antibodies include Series Therapeutics monoclonal antibody used in conjunction with a dealer's choice antibiotic. And their claim to fame is a 31% reduction of reinfections, which you'd have to wonder where their market is if we don't have any reinfections and we're used front line. For vaccines, Pfizer and Sanofi have now failed with the vaccines. Pfizer is still hoping to get a portion of the C. difficile market in multiple recurrent cases down the line from frontline. But Pfizer management did mention, and you can find Fierce Biotech recently did an article, management of Pfizer suggested that frontline therapy for C. diff is over $1 billion peak year sales, and that dovetails perfectly with our financial modeling. So we have two polymerase 3C inhibitors right now, Ibezapolstat in phase 2B, treating patients with C. difficile infection. And as I mentioned briefly, ACX375C, which is also a polymerase 3C inhibitor, but it targets the treatment of patients with MRSA. MRSA is still 52% of all hospital-based infections across the United States. So 375 has got the same kill profile for bacteria as Cubicin did for AcurX Pharmaceuticals, which was $1 billion product, IV only, and our 375 will be IV and oral. So if anything, it would be bigger than Cubicin was. And we have a couple of senior R&D team members from AcurX Pharmaceuticals helping us develop 375 now. It's in preclinical at lead optimization, and we expect it to go into IND-enabling tox studies early in 2023. So the mechanism of action is that our Ibezapolstat and 375 get into the cytoplasm of the gram-positive bacterial cell, and they kill the cell, as well as stopping the DNA Pol3C enzyme from replicating the DNA. In so doing, we're both cytotoxic and cytostatic in nature, and we're doing further work to elucidate the mechanism of action, having gotten a grant from the country in Europe, Holland, Health Holland, granted $500,000 to further study the mechanism of action, which is being funded by Health Holland to us and Leiden University Medical Center in Holland. And that work is ongoing, and we expect data on that later this year. C. difficile will be a $1.7 billion market by the time Ibezapolstat were to come out, if clinical trials continue to be successful. We would expect to be frontline therapy because of the factors we talked about, our cure rates, lack of side effects, microbiome restoration, and the favorable bile acid proportionality. All of which is individually and in the aggregate better than anything else out there, including oral vancomycin, which is the standard of care. So we agree with Pfizer. Frontline therapy for Ibezapolstat will yield over $1 billion in peak year sales. And our second drug, 375, is still preclinical. We're sure it's over $1 billion market. We don't beat the drum too much on it, though. We won't until we get into the clinic. But once we do, we think that 375 could be a bigger opportunity even than Ibezapolstat. So with the phase 2A data and its success, our scientific team believes that not only does it validate targeting Pol3C as a clinical target, but it provides clinical validation that our medicine is able to kill resistant gram-positive bacteria by targeting Pol3C in other areas, not just C. difficile, but also MRSA, VRE, and other resistant pathogens. So by the end of day 3 of therapy in our phase 2A trial in patients with C. difficile, we were able to experience regrowth of the good bacteria in the gut. That good bacteria in the gut is what prevents people from getting other illnesses, diseases like cancer, diabetes, in addition to reinfection with C. difficile. The only area where we say yes on this chart for Ibezapolstat is firmicutes. And that's because C. difficile is a firmicute. No other firmicutes other than C. difficile are impacted by, they're not killed by our medicine. So as I mentioned, we have a very narrow spectrum antibiotic. We're able to kill C. difficile very, very readily. We have over 100 times the concentration of our medicine getting into the colon, the site of the C. diff infection. It doesn't absorb internally, so we're not worried about adverse events because of the low absorption rate. And we leave the healthy bacteria alone, unlike vancomycin, which is a big reason for their recurrence rate. So we're conducting a phase 2b trial now. We're enrolling patients actively at 14 trial centers, soon to be 22. And after phase 2, we'll meet with the FDA to design the phase 3 program. The phase 2 program does have a superiority exploratory endpoint in terms of impact on the microbiome of Ibezapolstat compared to the standard of care, oral vancomycin. And we hope to expand on that in phase 3. And the phase 3 trial, we hope, will be paid for non-dilutively as we anticipate the PASTEUR Act being passed. We understand it was a late scratch in the most recent omnibus bill passed through the Senate and signed by President Biden in favor of a national defense appropriation. But folks at the Antimicrobial Working Group and the Bioindustry Organization all believe that it will be passed sometime this year in one form or another. So why do we have an expectation of phase 2b success? There's a confluence of factors. It's the potency of our medicine getting into the colon, over 100 times the concentration needed, an excellent safety profile, the favorable microbiome effects, and the bile acid proportionality. And the fact that we're eradicating the C. difficile infection by the end of day 3, and also restoring the microbiome by the end of day 3 in a 10-day treatment regimen. So importantly, you know, the way we see it with our statistician team, if vancomycin does what it does historically, and they get 24 out of 32 cures, if they get 26 out of 32 cures, we can do just 24 out of 32, not anywhere near 100% like our 2A, and we would still be considered statistically non-inferior. I won't spend much time on our second drug, it being preclinical, but as mentioned, it is also a DNA pol-3C inhibitor. It targets the treatment of patients with MRSA. Still, more than half of the infections in US hospitals in the United States. It's an area of unmet medical need, and it's a serious and, of course, life-threatening infection, as many of you will know. And it's protected until December 2039. You know, I will say that it is eligible. It will for qualified infectious disease product designation by FDA, as well as a fast track designation, which are 2 designations we already have for our lead drug, Ibezapolstat. So we should get 10 years of market exclusivity for 375, running alongside the patents, just like we already have for Ibezapolstat. So the PASTEUR Act would pay sponsors of a new class of antibiotics, not a derivative of an old class. So something like amoxicillin, which is a derivative of penicillin, wouldn't qualify. But if you have a new class of antibiotics that target the treatment of a serious or life-threatening infection, the government would pay you $750 million to $3 billion as subscription payments under a license agreement over a 10-year period. And they would stockpile your drug, which they would then give out for free to those who need it. There would also be reimbursement to the company for the full cost of the phase 3 program. So folks who are more connected than we are suggest there's over a 50-50 chance that at some point in 2022, the PASTEUR Act will be passed. And the Democrats like the notion that it's a price control. And the Republicans like the notion that we will be antibiotic independent for life-threatening infections, which is something that came up with the recent COVID-19 pandemic and the country's interactions with China in that regard, where 95% of antibiotics are currently manufactured. So Bob DeLucci and I run AcurX. My experiences here, my largest success in pharma in the past 20 years was selling a company called BioEnvision with a childhood cancer drug to Genzyme. Prior to that, I was vocationally a corporate lawyer, buying and selling companies, as well as a healthcare auditor for Ernst & Young in New York, both in New York. My partner comes from Big Pharma, where he rose to the level of president of Sanofi US. He was a senior executive at Pfizer. And in those roles, he took a number of antibiotics out to market, and he runs our research and development team, which includes, as I mentioned before briefly, Shang Yu and Larry Morton, two of the senior R&D people from AcurX Pharmaceuticals that took Cubicin out for AcurX Pharmaceuticals before it got sold to Merck. So they're very familiar with drugs like our ACX375, which target the treatment of the same infections that Cubicin treated before it. So after having completed our IPO, we're continuing with certain non-dilutive grant opportunities. And at the same time, we're working on completing the 2B clinical trial for Ibezapolstat. And later in the year, we hope to do a couple of announcements for ACX375 upon completing the lead optimization, starting the regulatory work to get fast track designation and QIDP, and going into the pre-clin tox. And then once the PASTEUR Act is passed through the legislative process, we would then file what's called a CNA application under the PASTEUR Act for designation thereunder. You know, we've been given an opportunity to shadow draft certain portions of the PASTEUR Act, which we took advantage of. So we're very familiar with the process, and we would attempt to file the CNA application within 90 days of passage of the act. And that's AcurX Pharmaceuticals. I'd be delighted to take any questions.
Okay, David, thank you very much for the overview. Let's expand here a bit on a few of the topics. As you mentioned in your presentation, you're developing a new class of antibiotics as opposed to developing an antibiotic that is a new generation of an existing class. Tell us why that's important.
Well, the reason why that's important, Joe, is because, and you know, if you were to look at the CDC website or the WHO website or the AMR Action Fund website, there's descriptions which would match what I'm about to say. The reason why that's important is because bacteria have memories. So when bacteria gets treated over the course of your lifetime with different antibiotics, and you shake hands with me, for example, then the experiences of the bacteria on your hands share experiences with the bacteria on my hands. And those bacteria become more knowledgeable in how to avoid getting killed by any new generation of an existing antibiotic. It's easier for the bacteria to identify it as a me too penicillin or a me too cephalosporin. Whereas if you have a new class of antibiotics, it's totally unseen by the bacteria in the history of the world. And so that bacteria, you're not going to experience what scientists show after 5 years of plateau of a newly approved antibiotic. There's a dramatic decrease in the effectiveness because the antibiotic exposure causes bacteria to identify it as medicine. And that occurs with every new antibiotic. At 5 years, new generations of existing bacteria kind of fall off that cliff, but new antibiotics, new classes, they have a much longer duration of maximum efficacy.
During your presentation, you mentioned that that Ibezapolstat is a dual impact drug. You spoke about some of the gut biome part of it. Tell us a little bit more about how that works.
Sure. So every person has a microbiome, which is basically the environment in your GI tract, which has healthy bacteria that is the first line of defense against getting disease or illness, including C. difficile, colonization, cancer, diabetes. So what happens is when you take antibiotics for anything, most antibiotics have a very disruptive effect on your microbiome. That's part of the reason why a lot of folks have been looking at other ways to eliminate infection other than the traditional approach of using antibiotics. So what we've, and those ways have in large part failed, like the Pfizer and the Sanofi vaccines, for example. The series program has a minor, in my view, decrease in the reinfection rate. But if you were to have an antibiotic that can not just be agnostic to the microbiome while curing the direct infection, but if you're actually restoring the microbiome while curing the direct infection better than anything else on the market, now you have a dual impact. It's doing the patient, it's leaving the patient much better than where you found them, not just because you're curing the infection, but because you're making them stronger to avoid reinfection of the C. diff as well as other diseases.
The competitive landscape in this area, how has it developed? Are we seeing more companies coming in, companies going out in terms of new therapies? What is going on in the space?
Well, so in the space currently, oral vancomycin is the standard of care, even though it's 60 years old with a lot of antimicrobial resistance, and even though it's got a 20 to 40% reinfection rate. Now, for under development programs, Pfizer recently announced 2 weeks ago that its vaccine failed the primary endpoint, but it's staying in the space in multiple recurrent infection areas. So a niche down the line from frontline. Sanofi's vaccine failed 5 years ago. Summit Therapeutics ridinilazole had a $225 million market cap with only ridinilazole, a C. diff phase 2 program, which now failed phase 3. And as I understand it, they're hiving that off, and that's going away. So really the seas have parted for us, and frontline therapy is available not only because our data is as good as it is, but because the competitive landscape is it's just cluttered with things that are falling by the wayside.
With regards to the COVID situation here that's gripped the country over the past handful of years here, what kind of challenges is that presenting to you for your enrollment in your studies, things of that nature? Where does that stand?
Well, so for sure, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected us like it's affected everyone else. We had backlog to get the blister packs ready, because the aluminum foil that you may recall from, everyone's had amoxicillin before. They have that silver foil. We needed that silver foil. Unfortunately, it comes from China and was sitting in Los Angeles harbor. So that was a long time in coming. And there were other things, but most recently, in early October, the White House didn't approve mass production of the PCR test kits, which had an indirect impact on us, because those PCR test kits are not just used to test for COVID, but they're used for the pre-screening of patients with C. difficile. So that set us back a while until that could be resurrected. So we've had our share of delays, but that said, we seem to be up and running again, and enrolling at a pretty decent pace. So we're pretty happy to have gotten through it.
One final question here. I was fascinated when you were talking about the Pasteur Act and what it could possibly mean for the company. Can you give us some background on that?
Yeah, so the Pasteur Act is a pull incentive, as opposed to the traditional push incentives that got the antibiotic space into the broken nature where you find it today. Basically, push incentives are small grants by NIH and Wellcome Trust and the like to push along new antibiotics in R&D. And those incentives were not nearly enough in order to get the medicines out to market. And they left us in a position where we haven't had a new class of antibiotics in over 30 years. So as Scott Gottlieb is a large proponent, along with the FDA, the CDC, the WHO, and the bioindustry organization, they're all proponents of this new pull incentive, which would bring money back into the space from the institutional investors, because it would put us back on par or better than the profits you can make from, say, your average oncology drug. And how does it do that? Well, if you can get your program through phase 2 financially, it would pay for phase 3 and pay you $750 million to $3 billion over 10 years. So 75 million to 300 million each year from the U.S. government under a license agreement between AcurX and the U.S. government to stockpile our antibiotic across hospitals in the U.S. And that would basically put the antibiotic sector back on the map. And it would mean the type of profitability that folks are able to get in other sectors. So prior to the pest, and that would only apply to about 20% of the antibiotics that are under development, because most antibiotics are new generations of an existing class, or they don't treat a life-threatening infection. But for a portion of the antibiotic sector, that would really pick the sector back up and put it on par with the type of profits that hedge funds would be interested in.
David, we hit our time limit here. Thank you very much for your presentation and all the information you've provided us. Sounds like some exciting times ahead for AcurX. We greatly appreciate your time. To anyone out there that has not already signed up for a one-on-one meeting with David, again, please visit the Lytham Partners website at lythampartners.com/virtual and click the one-on-one meeting request button. We hope you enjoy the conference and have a great day. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks for your time.